Thomas Muthi. Thomas is a Kenyan evangelist whose work carried him not only to African nations but also to Scotland. While he was on an evangelistic tour in Scotland, he really felt God calling him to plant a church. And not just any place, but in the city of Kiambu, which is the town a few miles away from the capital of Kenya, Nairobi. At first, Thomas was very doubtful if he was really hearing God's word. First of all, he had never seen himself as a church planter. As an evangelist, yes, but not as a church planter. So he wanted to make sure that he was hearing God rightly. Not only that, but the town of Kiambu has had a horrible reputation. Throughout Kenya, it was known as the center of crime, violence, drunkenness, immorality, corruption, and spiritual oppression. It was known as the murder capital of Kenya. There had been many failed church plant attempts there in the past. Many pastors had left the town in defeat. There were a few churches, but they were all small. They all seemed to get to a certain point and then just top out at fewer than 15 or 20 or 30 people. Whereas throughout other areas of Kenya, there was a huge revival going on. This place just seemed frozen and locked. But Thomas and his wife believed God, and they began to pray. Before they ever even visited the city, they embarked on a 6-month journey of prayer and fasting. They recognized that the battle there was a battle of spiritual warfare, that there was something in the town that was preventing God's Spirit from breaking through. And after some time of prayer, he identified it as a spirit of witchcraft. And he began to pray specifically against that spiritual power. At the end of 6 months, he believed that it was time for them to go to the city, and he began an evangelistic campaign. There was some response, and he began looking for a place where their church could meet, their new church. And at first they were just meeting in a municipal hall, where they could use the space on Sundays only. But he wanted a place that he could use as a church all week long, 24/7. He found a basement that was available, and so that was where he began his church, in a basement. It became known popularly as the prayer cavern, or the prayer cave, because he opened it up for prayer 24/7. He realized that his success there was going to depend on continuous prayer. A little time went by, and he realized that much of the source of the spiritual oppression in the town seemed to come from a particular woman known as Mama Jane, who practiced witchcraft. She put up fierce spiritual opposition to them. She was very powerful. Leaders of the city came to her so that she would cast spells for them for political success. People came to her when they were making new investments and would ask her to put charms against their enemies and for their good investment. So there was a lot of power invested in this woman, and there was a lot of resistance to opposing her. He asked then for intercessors. He gathered a team of 9 people committed to pray for him. One of them each day would pray and fast, specifically for the ministry of the church and against the spiritual power. He also called armor bearers to them, so that the person who was praying, say on Monday, was being also covered in prayer by the person who had prayed on Sunday and the person who would pray on Tuesday. In time, they reached a turning point where former practitioners of witchcraft were converting to Christ. They were leaving the satanic and the occult behind and following Jesus. And finally, there came a time of almost a direct confrontation with this woman who had exercised so much power. Because her power had decreased, the police were no longer afraid to confront her. And when they raided her home, they discovered lots of evidence of witchcraft there, and she eventually left town. Today, the prayer cave has 4,000 members, and there's been a citywide revival. This example of powerful prayer in our time, we can find repeated throughout the Bible. James cites Elijah. Elijah, a prophet of God, who opposed the evil king Ahab. Ahab had continued the idolatry of his father and pushed it even a step further. And God directed Elijah to pray that there would be a drought, and there was no rain for 3.5 years. During that time, God provided for Elijah, and it came to a climax on Mount Carmel, where the priests of Baal and Elijah both prayed that God would send fire. The priests of Baal prayed all day long, loudly, longly, even cutting themselves to appease their gods, but nothing happened. Then when it was Elijah's turn to pray, he directed that water be poured over the wood, the sacrifice, even the rocks themselves. And then he simply asked that God would reveal his power, at which point the entire altar was consumed by God in flame. And at that point, God told Elijah that the fast and the drought was over, and that he could pray for rain, and rains came. Elijah's not the only person in the Old Testament. Abraham prayed that God would spare the city of Sodom for the sake of a handful of innocent people. Moses prayed throughout the entire Exodus for God to give them guidance and direction. Daniel prayed in the face of opposition. In the New Testament, too, we find many, many incidents of prayer. Jesus, of course, praying at every turn, teaching his disciples to pray, praying for every important event and decision that he made during his earthly ministry. The book of Acts recounts time after time after time that the early church prayed. In Acts 1:14, we're told the believers joined together constantly in prayer. 1:23, the disciples prayed before choosing a successor to Judas.